Before dawn, the sea east of Samar lay deceptively calm, a wide gray sheet, breathing with low swells while clouds dragged their shadows, like bruises across the water, and in that uneasy stillness, a lone American destroyer cut forward at flank speed. Her bow punching white scars into the surface, her crew, already awake long before the sun, because sleep had abandoned them hours earlier. When radar whispers and frantic signals told a story no one wanted to believe, a massive Japanese surface force was charging straight toward a thin screen of escort carriers and destroyers ships never meant to face. Battleships at point-blank range, yet the order that settled over the bridge was not retreat, not surrender, but attack, because there was no other choice, and because sometimes history turns on the resolve of a single ship. The destroyer was small by comparison, barely a sliver of steel with thin armor and 5-inch guns, designed to fight other destroyers, not monsters armed with 14 and 16-inch cannons. Yet she carried something the enemy could not measure: a captain who understood that time mattered more than survival, and a crew who believed that duty did not shrink just because the odds grew impossible as the first pale light crept over the horizon. Lookouts spotted towering pagoda masts and the unmistakable silhouettes of battleships, looming like moving islands, and the radio crackled with reports that confirmed the nightmare. 5 Japanese battleships, supported by heavy cruisers and destroyers, advancing in line abreast, their guns already swinging to bear. In that moment, fear was real and physical, a tightening in the chest, a dryness in the mouth. But it did not paralyze, it sharpened, because the mission was clear: delay the enemy, confuse them, break their formation, even if it cost everything. The destroyer accelerated, smoke generators roaring to life, laying down thick black curtains that smeared the sea and hid the fragile carriers behind a wall of darkness. And as the first enemy salvos splashed down, towering columns of water, erupting like geysers, the ocean itself seemed to recoil. The captain ordered a turn toward the enemy, not away, and the ship heeled hard as rudder bit water engines, screaming beyond safe limits, every man at his station, knowing that a single hit could tear the ship apart, yet also knowing that hesitation would doom those they protected. Guns opened up, 5-inch shells arcing toward distant steel, while torpedoes were readied, their long silver bodies the only weapons capable of killing giants. The Japanese battleships answered with thunder, the sound, not a crack but a sustained tearing roar that rolled across the water and slammed into the hull with concussive force, even when the shells missed fragments and shock waves shook the destroyer, violently knocking men off their feet, ripping antennas away, and shredding rigging like paper. Still she drove on, weaving through splashes so close the deck was drenched, and salt stung eyes and lips. The torpedo director called ranges, the captain waited for the narrow wind distance and angle aligned, and then gave the command, and one by one the torpedoes leapt from their tubes, leaving foaming trails toward the enemy line. And for a heartbeat, the world seemed to hold its breath, because if they hit, the balance would change, and if they missed, there would be nothing left. The destroyer swung hard to present the smallest target, and began a wild zigzag run, firing guns as fast as crews could load the air, thick with cordite smoke and sweat and burning paint, as near misses burst against the hull, tearing holes above the waterline, starting fires that damaged. Control parties fought with hoses and bare hands, while medics dragged the wounded to what shelter they could find. Amid the chaos, reports came in: torpedoes running true battleships, turning away, forced to maneuver, breaking their line, and buying precious minutes. And minutes were everything, because every minute meant the carriers could launch another desperate wave of aircraft, armed with whatever they could carry: bombs, depth charges, even machine guns strafing decks to add to the confusion. The destroyer, now alone ahead of the smoke, was a magnet for enemy fire. Shells straddled her repeatedly, one smashed into the superstructure, exploding in a storm of metal and flame, killing men instantly and blasting the bridge with smoke. Yet command held orders, passed by shouting runners when phones went dead, steering by hand when power failed, the captain wounded but still standing refused evacuation, eyes fixed on the enemy silhouettes that seemed impossibly close. Now massive gray walls sliding through the smoke, their guns tracking Relentlessly, another hit flooded engineering spaces, slowing the ship. But she refused to die, limping forward. Still firing, still drawing fire away from the carriers behind the smoke. The sea around her was a boiling cauldron of splashes, oil, and debris. Aircraft roared overhead, diving fearlessly into flak to drop their loads and pull up at the last second, some not pulling up at all, and the destroyer cheered each time a plume rose. Another moment stolen from defeat. The Japanese fire intensified as range closed shells, screaming and faster now, the sound alone enough to make teeth rattle and nerves scream. Yet the crew moved with grim focus, reloading, aiming, repairing whatever could be repaired, because training and trust carried them when hope thinned. The ship turned again, charging into a gap in the smoke to make herself visible, deliberately baiting the enemy, and it worked. The battleships shifted fire, chasing the small, fast target that dared to defy them, and in that pursuit they lost sight of the carriers that were the true prize. The destroyer took another crippling blow, steering jammed, speed bleeding away, fires spreading, but even as she slowed, her guns continued to bark, defiant to the end, and the captain ordered the colors kept flying high, because surrender was never an option, not here, not now. As the sun climbed higher, revealing the full scale of the battle, the sea was littered with wreckage. She had challenged giants head-on and forced them to turn, and in doing so she altered the course of was drawing near. Yet, even as fate closed in, the spirit aboard that small ship burned brighter than the fires consuming her, and every man knew that whatever happened next, their stand would echo far beyond the smoke and the noise, into the quiet pages of history, where courage is measured not by victory alone, but by the will to fight when defeat seems certain. And in those final moments, as shells fell like rain and the ship shuddered and slowed, the destroyer remained what she had been since the first order was given: a shield, a challenge, and a promise kept that the enemy would not pass unopposed, not today, not without paying a price that would haunt them long after the guns fell silent. As the morning wore on, the destroyer's fight only grew more desperate, because survival was no longer the objective, delay was, and every second demanded payment in steel, blood, and endurance. The ship, now scarred and smoking, pressed on through the haze, her silhouette intermittently vanishing behind curtains of smoke and reappearing closer than any sane commander would allow, and each time she emerged, enemy gunners snapped their sights onto her, as if angered by the audacity of such defiance. A battleship's secondary batteries opened up streams of fire, the sharp, cracking thunder of smaller guns raking the water around her, stitching lines of splashes that crept closer and closer until fragments began to pepper the deck and superstructure. Like lethal hail, damage control teams worked continuously, plugging holes, shoring bulkheads, carrying the wounded below when there was space, and above when there was not, because fires and flooding fought for dominance in the cramped interior, and the ship felt smaller with every passing minute. The captain ordered another torpedo attack, knowing full well that the chances were slim, but also knowing that forcing the enemy to turn again would buy more time, and the crew responded with practiced efficiency, swinging tubes into position, calculating leads, despite broken instruments and shouted numbers, because the noise drowned everything else. When the torpedoes ran, they did not wait to see the results. Instead, they turned sharply, throwing the ship into another violent evasive pattern, engines coughing as strain took its toll, and then a roar went up from the deck because one of the massive enemy ships sheared away abruptly, a telltale sign that the threat had been real, even if the hit was uncertain. The Japanese formation continued to unravel, not collapsing, but losing the clean order that allowed battleships to bring their full power to bear. And that confusion spread as aircraft descended again and again, pilots attacking from impossible angles, dropping whatever they had left, strafing decks to keep heads down, and nerves frayed. The destroyer became a focal point, a stubborn irritant that refused to die. And in the chaos of smoke and maneuver, the enemy misjudged her strength, mistaking aggression for numbers and overestimating the force they faced. This miscalculation mattered because it slowed their advance, and hesitation at this moment was fatal to their mission. As shells continued to fall, one exploded close aboard, blasting a hole near the waterline, and flooding surged in the ship, taking on a list that made movement hazardous and aiming difficult. Yet the order came to keep firing because even damage to destroyers' guns could still distract, still provoke, still draw fire, and that was enough. Men fought exhaustion as much as fear, hands burning from salt and sweat. But there was no thought of stopping, because stopping meant the carriers would be exposed, and the carriers meant thousands of lives. Mist slammed water across the deck with such force it felt like hitting solid ground. The captain, still visible to all, refused to abandon the bridge, even as splinters cut through uniforms and smoke choked the air, because presence mattered, and seeing him there steadied the crew more than any speech could have. As the range closed again, the battleship's main guns roared, igniting fuel, rupturing pipes, and killing instantly those caught in its path. The shock threw men against bulkheads, extinguished lights, and briefly silenced guns. But even in the darkness, emergency lamps flickered on, and voices rose, counting heads, assigning tasks, dragging the wounded clear, because training took over when instinct threatened to give way. The ship slowed further speed, dropping below what was needed to outrun concentrated fire in the sea. Seemed to lean in closer, as if sensing the end drawing near. Yet even then the destroyer turned again, making herself visible through thinning smoke, because the carriers were still retreating and needed every distraction they could get. Enemy shells now bracketed her perfectly, splashes landing fore and aft, a deadly geometry that left little room to maneuver, and fragments rained down, cutting lines, smashing optics, ripping through exposed flesh. The forward gun continued to fire until a direct hit destroyed it in a blinding flash. Then seconds before, and still another gun answered from aft, its crew reduced but unbroken firing until ammunition ran low and barrels glowed with heat. Aircraft continued to appear overhead, some limping, some aflame, diving anyway, because the example. The enemy finally began to pull away, not in panic, but in decision, turning their heavy ships to pursue what they believed were more significant threats, misled by reports and the chaos of battle. And in that shift, the destroyer achieved what had once seemed impossible. She had forced giants to look elsewhere, buying the carriers the distance they needed, the cost, however, mounting to the point where stations were manned by the wounded and the exhausted. The captain, knowing the ship could no longer fight, ordered preparations for abandonment. But even that was done deliberately, guns firing until the last possible moment, to ensure the enemy remained focused elsewhere. As the ship slowed to a crawl, she settled deeper in the water, her deck awash with oil and debris, and the air filled with the hiss of steam and the crackle of flames. Colors still flew, and men gathered what wounded they could, lowering rafts under fire, because the enemy captain was last to leave, ensuring no one remained aboard. And as he stepped into the water, he looked back at the ship that had carried them into history, not as a symbol, but as a living thing that had fought beyond expectation and now surrendered. To the sea, the destroyer rolled slowly, her bow rising her, marking the place where she had stood against 5 battleships and refused to yield. Battle, however, was not yet over for those in the water, because survival now depended on endurance and chance. Floating amid debris, clinging to rafts, wounded exposed to sun and salt, while distant gunfire faded and aircraft droned overhead, sometimes friend, sometimes foe. Yet even here the impact of their stand echoed, because the carriers were safe, the enemy had turned away, and the morning that had begun with near certain destruction ended with improbable survival. The men in the water did not know all of this, yet they only knew that they had done what was asked, and that was enough. And as hours passed in rescue, finally came the story of that destroyer. Began its transformation from desperate action to legend, not because of speeches or medals, but because a single ship had challenged overwhelming force head-on, and by doing so had bent fate, just enough to change the outcome of a battle that would shape the course of the war. The aftermath unfolded slowly and painfully for the survivors, because courage does not end when the guns fall silent, it lingers in exhaustion. Burns and wounds and drifts on open water under an unforgiving sun. Men clung to rafts, debris, and life. The sea that morning was deceptively calm again, as if indifferent to what had just happened, and that calm was its own cruelty, because it left survivors exposed with no shelter from heat, salt, or thirst. Hours passed, measured not by clocks but by pain and fading strength, and yet discipline held even here. The wounded and kept watch for aircraft or ships, because the battle was not truly over until rescue arrived. Enemy aircraft occasionally appeared overhead. Shadow but fortune held, and eventually friendly planes circled, low dropping smoke markers and supplies, the first tangible sign that they had not been forgotten. When rescue ships finally arrived, pulling men from the water, hands reaching down, gripping wrists, uniforms slick with oil and blood, relief mixed with grief, because not everyone had survived, and every empty space on the deck was a reminder of that cost. The survivors spoke little at first, because words felt inadequate, and because exhaustion demanded silence, but as they were wrapped, treated, and given water, the reality settled in. They had lived through something extraordinary, something that would be studied, argued over, and remembered long after the pain faded. The carriers they had protected were safe. Their pilots had returned, many damaged, but alive, and the enemy surface force had turned away, abandoning its mission. The immediate danger had passed, but the meaning of what had happened was only beginning to take shape. In the days that followed, reports were written, testimony gathered, and commanders struggled to make sense of how such a small force had defied expectations and survived against overwhelming odds. Analysts would later point to tactical errors, miscommunication, and confusion on the enemy side, but those explanations never fully captured the human element. The willingness of crews to press attacks they knew were likely suicidal, the decision of a captain to charge instead of flee the way aggression created the illusion of strength and forced hesitation where none should have existed. The destroyer's stand became a focal point because it embodied these truths in stark terms. A single ship acting decisively had disrupted a fleet and altered the course of an engagement that could have ended in catastrophe. Had the carriers been caught and destroyed, the broader campaign would have been thrown into chaos. Supply lines broken, momentum lost, and countless additional lives placed at risk. Instead, the outcome reinforced a lesson as old as warfare itself, that resolve, imagination, and sacrifice can compensate for material disadvantage in ways that defy calculation. The story traveled quickly through the fleet, carried by survivors, pilots, and sailors, who repeated it with growing clarity, each retelling sharpening the image of a small ship charging giants through smoke and fire. Newspapers later condensed it into headlines, and official histories framed it within larger narratives, but those who had been there remembered details that never made it into print. The sound of shells tearing the air, the way the deck jumped underfoot, the smell of burning paint and cordite, the sight of a captain steady amid chaos. These memories mattered because they humanized the event, transforming it from an abstract example into a lived experience that could inspire future generations of sailors. Officers would later teach the engagement in classrooms, pointing to maps and diagrams explaining maneuver and timing, but veterans knew that the decisive factors were harder to chart. Fear mastered loyalty to ship and crew, and an unspoken agreement that some things were worth any price. The destroyer herself, though gone, continued to serve as a symbol, a reminder that size and firepower are not the sole measures of strength, and that initiative can force even the mightiest opponent to react defensively. In awarding honors and citations, the Navy sought to recognize this truth. Medals pinned to chests could not replace those lost, but they affirmed that the sacrifice had meaning, and that the courage displayed set a standard. Few of the survivors considered themselves heroes. Many insisted they had simply done their jobs, yet the very insistence underscored the culture that made such actions possible, a culture where responsibility to others outweighed concern for oneself. Over time, as the war moved on and new battles demanded attention, the memory of that morning did not fade. It settled into the collective consciousness, shaping how sailors thought about their roles and what might be asked of them under extreme circumstances. The engagement influence doctrine, emphasizing aggressive screening tactics, the value of smoke, and the psychological impact of bold action. But more than that, it reinforced morale, proving that defeat was not inevitable, even when the odds appeared hopeless. This mattered immensely in a long war where endurance was as important as victory, and where belief in eventual success sustained men through months and years of hardship. For the families of those who did not return, the knowledge that their loved ones had played a crucial role offered some measure of comfort, though it could never fill. The absence letters and notifications framed loss in terms of duty and honor, and while such words could feel hollow, they carried a truth forged in action, not rhetoric. The destroyer's challenge head-on against 5 battleships became a touchstone, invoked whenever courage was needed, whenever doubt crept in, because it demonstrated that fate is not a fixed line, but a field of possibilities shaped by choice. In reflecting on the battle, historians often emphasize the improbability of the outcome. And they are right to do so, because probability alone would have predicted disaster, yet focusing solely on chance misses the deeper lesson. Chance favors those who act decisively, who refuse to concede initiative, who understand that even delaying an enemy can have cascading effects beyond immediate survival. The destroyer did not win in the conventional sense. She did not sink all her adversaries or sail home intact, but she achieved her objective, and in war objectives define victory. Her sacrifice ensured the survival of others, preserved combat power, and maintained momentum at a critical juncture. And that is why her story endures. As years passed and the survivors' aged reunions brought them together, men once young, now marked by time, sharing stories, filling gaps, honoring those who could not attend because they had paid the ultimate price. They stood before memorials, read names, and remembered not just the battle, but the camaraderie, the quiet moments before dawn, the laughter amid tension, because those memories were as much a part of the experience as the violence. The sea where the destroyer went down remained unchanged, waves rolling endlessly, yet beneath them lay a chapter of history invisible to the casual observer, but vivid to those who knew. The lesson carried forward beyond naval circles into broader discussions of leadership and ethics, because it illustrated the power of example and the impact one decision can have on countless lives. Leaders studying the event note how clarity of purpose enabled rapid action, how trust between captain and crew allowed orders to be executed without hesitation, and how moral courage supported physical bravery. Together, these elements created a force multiplier that no amount of steel alone could provide. In the end, the destroyer's challenge was not merely against battleships, but against the notion that individuals are powerless in the face of overwhelming systems. Her story asserts the opposite, that individuals acting together with conviction can bend events even when circumstances seem predetermined. Fate in this sense is not an external force, but a consequence of choices made under pressure, and on that morning a small ship chose to confront rather than evade, to protect rather than preserve itself, and in doing so altered history. The waves closed over her hull and time moved on, but the echo of her guns and the resolve of her crew continue to resonate, reminding all who hear the story that courage measured in moments can shape outcomes lasting generations, and that sometimes the stand of one is enough to change the course of many.